somewhere beneath the Caribbean Sea, in waters so deep and so dark that sunlight has not touched them in over 300 years, there rests a ship. It lies approximately 600 meters below the surface, roughly the height of 2 Eiffel Towers stacked end to end, cloaked in the quiet pressure of the abyss, undisturbed by the centuries that have passed above it. Its wooden hull has long given way to the sea, but its cannons remain. Bronze, ornate, each one etched with the curling silhouette of a dolphin, they jut from the sediment like sentinels, the last proud markers of something that was, once, the most powerful treasure ship on the face of the earth. This is the San Jose, and what it carries, or what it is believed to carry, has made it perhaps the single most disputed object on the planet. Dubbed the Holy Grail of shipwrecks, the San Jose is believed to hold 11 million gold and silver coins, emeralds, and other precious cargo collected from Spanish-controlled colonies. Conservative estimates place its current value somewhere around $17 billion. Others say more. A small number of voices say the figure is overinflated, though notably, none of those voices are diving down to check. It is a story about treasure, yes, but it is also a story about empire, about war, about the people who built a ship and the people who sent it to its death. It is a story about greed stretching across centuries, from the sunlit courts of Madrid to the courtrooms of Colombia and the United States, from the silver mines of Bolivia to the quiet archive rooms of Seville, where a Cuban archaeologist once sat alone with a stack of documents and felt his hands begin to tremble. To understand the San Jose, we must begin not at the bottom of the sea, but at the beginning. The San Jose was completed in 1698 at a shipyard in Mapil, Usurbil, near San Sebastián, in the Basque country of northern Spain. She was designed by Francisco Antonio Garrot and built by Pedro de Arostegui, who constructed twin ships simultaneously, the San Jose and her sister ship, the San Joaquin. The two vessels were built to specification, engineered for the particular demands of the Spanish crown's most essential lifeline, the treasure fleet. To understand what that means, one must understand the world these ships were born into. Spain, in the late 17th century, was not merely a country, she was an empire. Her territory stretched from the Iberian Peninsula across the Atlantic to vast swaths of the Americas, from the jungles of Peru to the silver mountains of Bolivia, from the trading ports of Panama to the sugar coasts of Cuba. And all of that colonial wealth, all of that gold and silver pulled from the earth by the labor of indigenous peoples and enslaved workers, needed to find its way home. Known in Spain as the Flota de Indias, and often called the Silver Fleet, this convoy system ferried gold, silver, and jewels from South America to Spanish coffers. It was not simply a series of ships, it was an artery, the circulatory system of an empire, moving the wealth of an entire continent from one side of the world to the other on a regular, scheduled basis. And like any artery, what happened when it was cut was catastrophic. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The wealth flowing through this system was staggering in its scale. Colonial records suggest the official cargo aboard the San Jose alone included up to 200 tons of precious metals and stones. Unofficial estimates, accounting for the contraband that Spanish colonists routinely smuggled on their ships to avoid taxation, suggest the actual treasure may have been even greater. Some have even called it the biggest treasure in the history of humanity. The San Jose's riches were intended to fund Philip V of Spain's cause in the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict between two royal houses, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, and their supporters across Europe. The war had begun after Charles II died childless in 1700, leaving the Spanish throne to his Bourbon great-nephew, Philip, a rival claimant. The Habsburg Archduke Charles of Austria mounted a competing bid for the crown. France backed the Bourbon cause, while Britain, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire threw their support behind the Habsburg faction. In other words, the treasure aboard the San Jose was not merely wealth. It was a war chest. It was the difference between a crown holding and a crown falling. One of these flotillas set sail from Spain and arrived in Cartagena in 1706. It carried goods to be exchanged with traders from the Viceroyalty of Peru at a planned fair in Portobello, on the east coast of Panama. Lack of enthusiasm among the Peruvian merchants, likely due to an arduous journey under threat of attack by the English, delayed the event for more than a year. It was a delay that would, in the end, cost 600 men their lives. In May 78, the fair was finally held, and the San Jose departed from Portobello, packed to capacity with treasure, chests of gold doubloons, bars of silver, bags of uncut emeralds, and other items. Approximately 12 million reales worth of gold, silver, and valuables had been loaded onto the San Jose during the Portobello Fair. The cargo included silver and gold, mined at Potosi in present-day Bolivia. These were not abstract figures. They were the condensed labor of a continent, pulled from mountains, shaped in mints, and sealed into chests that now sat in the hold of a ship sailing north through Caribbean waters. The fleet's valuable cargo made it a prime target for English Royal Navy Commodore Charles Wager, whose objective was to intercept and, if possible, capture the Spanish galleons and merchant ships returning from the Portobello Fair. Wager had been waiting. He had been patient, and on the evening of June 8, 1708, his patience ran out. The Spanish were nearing Cartagena when they were intercepted by Wager, who had been patrolling for months. His force consisted of 4 powerful warships and a fireship. The two sides spotted one another and lined up for battle. The largest ships, the San Jose and Wager's expedition, squared off, while the English Kingston faced the San Joaquin. The battle heated up around nightfall, and then, in the darkness and the smoke and the rolling cannon fire of that Caribbean night, something happened that no one, not the English, not the Spanish, not the 600 souls aboard, could have predicted or survived. The powder magazines of the San Jose detonated, destroying and sinking the Spanish warship, along with all of the gold, silver, emeralds, and jewelry intended for the Spanish king. Nearly all of the roughly 600 passengers and crew on board the San Jose died when the ship sank. In a matter of minutes, some accounts say seconds, the mightiest treasure ship in the world was gone. The cause of the sinking has since been debated. British documents indicate that the ship did not explode, while Spanish reports suggest it was blown up in battle. 300 years later, that question remains open. What is not open is the outcome. The ship went down, the treasure went with it, and the sea closed over both as though neither had ever existed. For centuries, the sunken hoard of gold, silver, and emeralds passed into legend. The holy grail of shipwrecks. Lying in roughly 3,000 feet of water, it was inaccessible until submersible technology matured in the 20th century. And when it was finally found, when the cameras finally descended, and the wreck finally came into view, what followed was not celebration. It was not clarity. It was a battle that continues to this day, a war fought not with cannons and powder, but with lawyers, governments, international courts, and the ancient enduring question of who has the right to the past. That story, the story of the San Jose, is the one we are here to tell. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside a shipyard just before dawn. The workers have not yet arrived. The tools are still. The timber, cut and stacked and waiting, holds the faint smell of the forests from which it came. Oak, pine, hardwood. The bones of a future vessel, not yet assembled, not yet breathing. In the Basque country of northern Spain, in the year 1697, that silence was about to be broken. at the shipyard of Mapil, in the coastal village of Usobil near San Sebastian. Two of the most important ships in the history of the world were about to be born, though no one, not yet, knew it. In 1697, Spanish shipwrights began constructing two identical sister ships in the Basque shipyard of Mapil near Usobil. The San Jose and San Joaquin were built simultaneously using traditional galleon design. Oak was used for the keel, pine for masts, and various hardwoods for the hulls. The Basque country was no accident of location. For generations, the people of this rugged northern coastline had been among the finest shipbuilders in Europe. Practical, disciplined craftsmen who understood wood and water the way a musician understands silence, not as the absence of something, but as the very medium in which everything moves. The Spanish crown had long drawn on Basque expertise for the vessels that would carry its empire across the Atlantic, and so it was here, in a yard that smelled of sawdust and salt air, that the San Jose took shape. The galleon was constructed under the direction of master shipwright Pedro de Aristegui, to designs by naval architect Francisco Antonio Garrot. She was launched in 1698, entering the water as a three-masted, three-decked vessel displacing over 1,000 tons, with a length of approximately 28 feet and a beam of 40 feet. Francisco Antonio Garrote designed both ships as mirror images, each stretching 150 feet long and bristling with 64 cannons across 3 gun decks. The San Jose carried 26 18-pounders on her lower deck, 26 10-pounders on the middle deck, and 12 6-pounders on her quarterdeck and forecastle. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. 64 cannons, 3 gun decks, 1,000 tons of displacement. This was not a merchant vessel with an escort. This was a floating fortress, a warship built to protect, to project power, and, if necessary, to destroy. She was the answer to a question the Spanish crown asked of its shipbuilders every generation. Build me something that can cross an ocean, carry a fortune, and survive anything the enemy sends against it. For a time, she did exactly that. But to truly understand the San Jose, to understand why she mattered, why she was loaded the way she was, why 600 men were willing to sail her into dangerous waters, one must understand the system she was born to serve. The Spanish treasure fleet was one of the great organizational achievements of the early modern world. Known in Spain as the Flota de Indias, and often called the Silver Fleet, this convoy system ferried gold, silver, and jewels from South America to Spanish coffers. It was not simply a series of ships, it was an artery, the circulatory system of an empire, moving the wealth of an entire continent from one side of the world to the other on a regular, scheduled basis. And like any artery, what happened when it was cut was catastrophic. The wealth flowing through this system was staggering in its scale. High in the Bolivian mountains, the silver mines of Potosi became perhaps the most valuable single location on Earth. Many workers died by the thousands extracting silver that filled ships like the San Jose. This single mining complex produced more silver than anywhere else. The gold and silver pulled from those mountains, pulled, it must be said, by the forced labor of indigenous peoples under conditions of extraordinary brutality, was smelted and minted and packed into ships that then made the long crossing north and east, riding the Caribbean currents toward the Atlantic and home. The Cara Cara people of Bolivia, whose ancestors worked those mines at Cerro Rico, have not forgotten this. They are still speaking about it today, still asserting their claim to the treasure that rests at the bottom of the sea. And their voice, quiet, persistent, and morally serious, is one we will return to later in this story. But first, back to the ship. First launched in 1698, the San Jose supported the defense of the Spanish city of Cadiz during the early years of the War of the Spanish Succession. She did not begin her life with a treasure carrier. She began it as a guardian, a naval vessel commissioned in the service of the Crown, a warship that happened also to have an enormous hold. It was only later, as the demands of empire shifted, that her role would evolve into something more consequential and, ultimately, more fatal. The San Jose sailed at the head of the first Tierra Firme fleet to depart for the Americas in more than a decade. That detail deserves to settle for a moment. More than a decade. The treasure fleets, disrupted by war and by the lurking threat of enemy ships, had not made the full crossing in over 10 years. The wealth had been accumulating, sitting in colonial ports, waiting for a moment of safety that never quite arrived. By the time the San Jose finally set sail for the New World in March of 1706, she was not just carrying the expectations of a king. She was carrying a decade's worth of deferred fortune. The fleet's valuable cargo made it a prime target for English Royal Navy Commodore Charles Wager, whose objective was to intercept and, if possible, capture the Spanish galleons and merchant ships returning from the Portobello Fair. The Portobello Fair was, in the language of the age, an event of considerable significance. Held on the eastern coast of Panama, it was one of the great commercial gatherings of the Spanish colonial world, a place where merchants from the Viceroyalty of Peru would bring their goods and their coin to be transferred northward towards Spain. But the fair that was planned for 1706 did not happen on schedule. Lack of enthusiasm among the Peruvian merchants, likely due to an arduous journey under threat of attack by the English, delayed the event for more than a year. So the fleet waited, and while it waited, the treasure continued to accumulate. And while the treasure accumulated, the British continued to watch. British spies in the region had been tracking the ship's movements for weeks, sending coded messages to Jamaica Station Commander Charles Wager. The intelligence network knew exactly when they would sail and roughly how much wealth they carried. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a carefully planned interception. It is worth pausing on that fact. The attack that would send the San Jose to the bottom of the sea was not the sudden violence of a chance encounter at sea. It was the product of months of surveillance, intelligence gathering, and cold, patient calculation. Wager had studied his target. He knew its route. He knew its cargo. He knew, roughly, when it would pass through the waters near Cartagena, and he positioned himself accordingly, waiting in the silence of the Caribbean, his ships steady on the water, for a fleet that did not yet know it was already hunted. On May 28, 1708, the fleet finally departed Portobello after months of preparation. The convoy consisted of the 3 heavily armed galleons, plus 14 merchant vessels carrying additional cargo and supplies. General Santillan commanded from the San Jose's quarterdeck, knowing British warships were prowling Caribbean waters. He knew, they knew, 600 men sailed forward anyway, because that was what the Crown required, and because the alternative, to leave the treasure sitting in Panama while a war raged back home, was not truly an alternative at all. The San Jose was a magnificent ship. She was built by skilled hands, designed by a careful mind, and crewed by men who knew the sea. But magnificence, as history repeatedly reminds us, is no protection against what is coming next. The evening of June 7, 1708 was quiet. The Spanish fleet had reached Isla de Bajú, a low, flat island draped in the green silence of the Colombian coast, just south of Cartagena. And there they dropped anchor. It had been a long sail from Portobello. The merchant vessels in the convoy were not built for speed. The 3 treasure galleons, the San Jose, the San Joaquin, the Santa Cruz, moved at the pace dictated by the slowest ship, which is to say they moved at the pace dictated by caution. Their commander, General José Fernández de Santillan, the Count of Casa Alegre, knew the waters around Cartagena were watched. He had been warned. The governor of Cartagena had sent him word. In April, Wager's squadron had taken on supplies on the small island of Pequeña Barú, just 30 miles away from Cartagena. The Spanish were aware of their presence, and the governor of Cartagena sent warnings to the Spanish fleet, which was anchored in Portobelo. Santillán had received those warnings. He had read them, and then, because he had no real choice, he had ordered his fleet to sail anyway. The hurricane season was coming. The rest of the combined fleet, waiting in Havana under the French Admiral Jean Ducasse, had sent word that they would not wait indefinitely. And the treasure, 11 million pesos in gold and silver, the war chest of a king, could not sit in Portobelo forever. So the fleet sailed into waters it knew to be dangerous, because danger was the condition of its world. They anchored off Baru on the evening of the 7th, and somewhere in the darkness not far away, Charles Wager waited. Captain Wager had written to the Board of Admiralty in London on April 13, 1708, with intelligence about the Tierra Firme fleet, noting that the king's money was ready to be shipped from Portobelo and amounted to 11 millions of pieces of eight. He knew what was coming. He had done his arithmetic, and he had positioned his 4 ships: the Expedition, the Kingston, the Portland, and the fireship Vulture. With the cold geometry of a man who intends to win, the Spanish fleet reached Isla de Bajú on the evening of June 7th and anchored there. The next day there was very little wind. That detail, very little wind, is worth holding for a moment. In the age of sail, wind was everything. Wind was the engine, the rudder, the escape. Without it, a ship sat exposed on the water, heavy and slow, unable to maneuver, unable to run. The Spanish fleet, loaded to capacity with one of the greatest concentrations of wealth in the history of the world, was sitting in nearly still water off a low island when the horizon changed. Around 3 in the afternoon, they noticed Wager's squadron approaching. The Spanish took up defensive positions, but the English knew they had to attack the largest ships because they had the most money on board. What unfolded next was not a chaotic storm of cannon fire. It was, in its way, methodical, a battle shaped by priorities, by calculations, by the knowledge on both sides of which ships mattered most. The British were not there to destroy. They were there to capture, to board, to take possession of the treasure and sail it home to England. Sinking the San Jose was never the plan. The Kingston attacked the San Joaquin around 5 in the afternoon, which, after 2 hours of battle, escaped into the night with the help of the Concepcion. The sister ship, carrying 5 million pesos of her own, slipped away in the gathering dusk, aided by her escort and the creeping cover of nightfall. She would arrive in Cartagena the following morning, treasure intact, having outmaneuvered one of the most powerful naval squadrons in the Atlantic. The Kingston's captain, Simon Bridges, would eventually face a court-martial for it. So would Captain Edward Windsor of the Portland. But that reckoning came later. In the moment, the loss of the San Joaquin meant that everything now depended on the larger engagement, the one being fought, as the sun began to descend toward the Caribbean horizon, between Charles Wager's flagship and the ship at the heart of this story. At sunset, the 70-gun HMS Expedition, helmed by Commodore Charles Wager, took on the 64-gun San Jose. For more than an hour, they traded broadsides, sailing past each other while firing their cannons at close range, pulverizing wood and bone. Let the reality of that settle quietly. 2 ships, moving slowly in still air, firing at one another from close range. The noise would have been extraordinary, a physical concussion of sound, repeating again and again, rolling across the flat water and echoing off the shore of Baru Island. Smoke thick enough to obscure the horizon. The smell of sulfur and burning wood, and something else, something iron and biological, that men who survive battles never forget and rarely describe. Wager's flagship, HMS Expedition, was severely damaged during the initial clashes, including the loss of masts from close-range broadsides exchanged with the San Jose. This was not a clean British triumph. The San Jose fought back. She was a warship, crewed by Spanish sailors who understood the stakes as well as any man on the expedition understood them. For an hour and a half, that engagement was a contest between equals, battered, determined, moving through smoke and low light toward a conclusion that neither side had fully written yet. The expedition attacked the San Jose and approached the vessel with the clear intention of boarding the ship. Around 7 in the evening, after an hour and a half of fierce fighting and with only 60 meters between the two ships, the San Jose suddenly blew up. 60 meters, less than the length of the ship herself. Wager's men would have seen the faces of the Spanish sailors across that gap. They were close enough, almost, to throw a rope. And then, in a single, catastrophic instant, the San Jose was gone. Survivor testimonies consistently described British cannon fire from HMS expeditions striking the galleon's hull, igniting stored gunpowder or combustibles that spread fire rapidly through the vessel before a catastrophic explosion rent the ship asunder. While most accounts emphasized the initial outbreak of flames, a minority explicitly noted hearing the blast, underscoring the swift transition from combat to total loss. Of the approximately 600 Spanish sailors and officers serving aboard, only 11 survived. 11 out of 600. The rest, men with names, with families in Spain or the colonies, with suppers they had planned to eat the following morning, went to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea along with the chests of gold, the bars of silver, the bags of uncut emeralds from the mountains of Peru and Colombia. They went down together, the living and the wealth, into waters so deep that the world above them would not find them for more than 300 years. What happened immediately after is a study in the particular frustration of historical ambiguity. The British could not approach the wreck site to salvage. Wager's British squadron observed the sinking from afar, but could not approach due to shallow waters, lingering smoke, and the risk of Spanish reinforcements from Cartagena. The treasure was gone, and with it, the entire strategic objective of the engagement. Wager had denied the Spanish king his war chest. He had not enriched the English one. In the hours that followed, the British turned their attention to what remained. By now it was dark, but there was a full moon, and Wager succeeded in finding the Santa Cruz at 2 in the morning. After a brief fight, the Santa Cruz was taken. However, she had no government treasure in her, only 13 chests of pieces of 8 and 14 pigs of silver, which appeared to be private property. The third ship, the small prize, the Consolation. The only British prize from the battle was the Santa Cruz, which turned out to contain a few pieces of 8, but no gold doubloons. While the British had starved the Spanish king, they had failed to enrich their own. The captains of the Kingston and Portland were later court-martialed for allowing the intact treasure ship San Joaquin to escape. Admiral Wager presided over the court-martials of Captain Bridges and Captain Windsor. Both were charged with poor performance, found negligent in their failure to pursue the San Joaquin, and dismissed from the Navy without pension. The war continued. It ended in 1730 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Philip IV of Spain, the king for whom the treasure was bound, the man whose crown had depended on that gold, kept his throne, though stripped of considerable territory. The House of Bourbon took its place in Madrid. The war that had sent the San Jose to sea, that had made her cargo so urgently necessary, eventually ended. But the San Jose did not surface with it. The treasure stayed down. The debate about why the ship exploded, whether a cannonball from the expedition struck the powder magazine, or whether the Spanish crew ignited it themselves to deny the British the prize, remained unresolved. British documents indicate that the ship did not explode, according to Colombia's government, while Spanish reports suggest the ship was blown up in battle. 3 centuries of argument between two documentary traditions, and the truth remains somewhere in 60 meters of closing distance, and one terrible instant of fire. What is not disputed is the aftermath. A painting now hangs in the collection of the Royal Museum's Greenwich, the work of the English marine painter Samuel Scott, depicting the final moments of the San Jose. Wager's vessel, the Expedition, is shown in the center, attacking the San Jose. The force of the gunfire seems to blow the Spanish vessel apart in a cloud of smoke and flames reflected on the water. It is a painting made from the imagination of a man born 6 years before the battle. But it captures something true, the spectacle and the scale and the permanence of that moment. The ship on fire, the treasure descending, the reflection of both on still Caribbean water. Wager returned to England, a rich man, knighted by Queen Anne in 1709. Though his disappointment at losing the greater prize of the San Joaquin never fully left him. And down below, in the dark, the San Jose settled into the sediment of the sea floor and began its long, quiet wait. The sea does not give back what it takes, not easily, not without a price of its own. In the days following the sinking of the San Jose, the Spanish colonial authorities in Cartagena were left to reckon with the magnitude of what had just occurred. Letters were drafted in the heat of a Caribbean summer, sealed with wax, and entrusted to a small sloop that slipped out of the harbor past the English blockade, still patrolling the coast. They were addressed to the governor of Havana, Cuba, then a Spanish colony, with instructions to forward them urgently to King Philip V in Madrid. The king needed to know. His flagship was gone. His war chest was at the bottom of the sea. 600 of his sailors were dead. The letters from Cartagena were reports dated 1708, smuggled past an English blockade to Havana so that the governor could forward them to Spain's king. Their tone and language stood out at once, references to galleons, English warships, gold and silver, and a disaster with many drowned. Those letters disappeared into the archives, and for a very long time, so did the San Jose. The immediate aftermath of the sinking produced no salvage. The depth was too great, the currents too unpredictable, and the technology of the early 18th century entirely unequal to the task. Efforts to locate the wreck began shortly after its sinking in 1708, with Spanish salvage operations employing divers and basic equipment, but these proved unsuccessful due to the site's depth exceeding 600 meters and strong currents off Barrow Island. The ship had gone down in water roughly 2,000 feet deep, a depth at which the ocean is not merely dark but actively hostile, a place where the pressure would crush any wooden diving bell attempted at the time, where no breath-holding diver could survive long enough to see anything worth seeing. So, the San Jose was left alone. The war ended. Empires shifted. The decades turned into generations, the generations into centuries. Spain gradually lost its grip on the Americas. The silver mines of Potosi, the same mines whose output had filled the San Jose's hold, were nationalized, then transformed, then forgotten by all but the people who lived in their shadow. The treasure fleet system that had carried so much wealth across the Atlantic for so long eventually ceased to operate, made obsolete by the very independence movements it had, in part, helped finance through colonial resentment. But the legend of the San Jose did not diminish with the empire that produced it. If anything, it grew. Treasure hunting started picking up speed in the late 1950s when technology finally allowed for deeper and longer dives. Because of countless reports of the treasure on board, San Jose became a legend in its own right, and more famous with each expedition that failed to return the expected discovery. The ship became the subject of stories told in the ports of Cartagena, in the dive bars of Panama, in the offices of maritime lawyers and the libraries of historians. Everyone who had ever heard of it had a theory about where it lay. Everyone who had ever sailed those waters had, at some point, looked down and wondered. In 1980, a group of American investors decided to stop wondering and start searching. The arguments began in 1980 when the Glockamora Company, a group of US explorers and investors now named Sea Search Armada claimed to have found the wreck. According to Sea Search Armada, the search was abandoned after the Colombian government backed out of an agreement to split the proceeds from the treasure's recovery. The story of Sea Search Armada is its own long and cautionary tale, the story of men who believed they had found the greatest treasure in history and spent the next 4 decades in courtrooms trying to prove it. On December 10, 1981, the company's side-scan sonar and magnetometer recorded a major target, which was investigated on subsequent dives. The crew found several large debris fields that they believed to be the San Jose, recalled Jack Harbiston, managing director of Sea Search Armada. It was right where our archival researchers said it should be. The subcrew could see wooden ship spars, square nails that had rusted out, and a cannon. A wood sample confirmed the wreck was the right age. Guacamora filed a report of its findings with the Colombian Maritime Authority in February 1982, including a map with the approximate coordinates of the San Jose. What happened next is a case study in the particular cruelties that treasure hunting tends to visit upon those who practice it. The Colombian government initially agreed to divide the treasure, keeping 65% and giving 35% to the explorers. However, they refused to allow Sea Search Armada to perform salvage. The nation's parliament then reneged on the deal and passed a law giving itself 25% of the rewards. Sea Search Armada sued in Colombian court and won a 50-50 split, but the Colombian government refused to follow the ruling of its own court. Decades of litigation followed. The investors who had funded the original search saw no return. The coordinates they had filed remained contested, and the San Jose remained on the bottom of the sea, undisturbed, accumulating not only sediment, but the weight of legal argument. Elsewhere, however, a different kind of search was underway, a quieter one, a longer one that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with obsession. Roger Dooley's quest, the one that would come to consume him and indeed define his life, began in Seville on a typically torrid July day in 1984. The 39-year-old archaeologist left his hotel after breakfast and made his way toward the Plaza del Triunfo. He checked his watch. A battered Rolex Sea Dweller he never took off his wrist, not even when showering or exploring shipwreck-strewn Caribbean waters. At the time, Dooley was the chief archaeologist for Cuba's state-owned Carasub organization, operating under orders from President Castro, who wanted him to find historic ships wrecked off the island country's shores and recover their riches. Dooley dreamed of being the first person to excavate a Spanish galleon in Cuban waters. To achieve this goal, he made a deal with Castro, though the dictator's plan to seize any artifacts recovered was at odds with the aim of underwater archaeology, which seeks to preserve sunken treasures. On this particular morning, Dooley was inside the General Archive of the Indies in Seville, one of the great repositories of human memory, a building housing 60 million documents dating back to Columbus, but with no comprehensive catalogue, no index. He was searching for an entirely different shipwreck. He was not looking for the San Jose. He was not thinking about the San Jose. In a file connected to Havana, Legajo 377, he found a sewn packet of letters dated 1708. The tone and language stood out at once. References to galleons, English warships, gold and silver, and a disaster with many drowned. Words and phrases immediately jumped out at him. Galleons, battle, English warships, gold, silver, His Majesty's treasure, and everybody drowned. The reports had been smuggled out of Cartagena in 1708, past an English blockade of the city. The small sloop that carried the messages was bound for Cuba, with instructions urging the governor of Havana to inform Philip V of the loss of his treasure-filled flagship. Dooley had found, by pure accident, critical clues to the location of the most valuable shipwreck in history. He had been looking for something else entirely, in an archive with no index, in a city baking under Andalusian summer heat. And there, sewn into a 6-inch thick ledger of colonial correspondence, was the San Jose. "That's the day I fell in love," Dooley later said. But love, as any archaeologist will tell you, does not pay the bills. And the path from that archive in Seville to the bottom of the Caribbean Sea would take Dooley more than 30 years, through a series of obstacles that would have broken anyone with a lesser degree of personal fixation. After uncovering archival clues to the San Jose's whereabouts, Dooley returned to Cuba and his day job with Carisub. Castro wanted the wrecks stripped for gold and silver. Dooley wanted to excavate them properly and ultimately quit over the disagreement. He remained in Cuba for more than a decade, professionally stranded. In the late 1990s, he escaped without a cent to his name and eventually settled in the United States, where he spent years trying to convince investors to fund a search for the San Jose. Decade after decade, archive after archive, he later discovered the San Jose's pilot's derrotero, a handwritten book of mariners' directions in the British Library. Each document was a piece of a puzzle he was assembling across the libraries and archives of 3 continents. He was not a wealthy man. He was not, in the conventional sense, a powerful one. He was simply a man who could not stop. Who had, in the reading rooms of Seville all those years ago, contracted an obsession that would not release him. In 2013, he finally succeeded in finding a backer. He teamed with Anthony Clegg, a wealthy English hedge fund partner, and together they formed Maritime Archaeology Consultants. Within months, Dooley had presented Colombia's President Santos with a 1729 map showing islets off Cartagena labeled Bajo del Almirante, perhaps a reference to Commodore Charles Wager himself. Intrigued, the president facilitated a meeting with his culture minister. The pieces were finally in place. The archive letters, the pilot's handbook from the British Library, the antique map, the right backer, the right moment, and the right technology, because the technology had, at last, caught up with the depth of the problem. In association with Colombia's Ministry of Culture, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution utilized a sophisticated autonomous underwater vehicle called the Remus 6000 to search 80 square nautical miles of seafloor, an area slightly larger than Orlando, Florida. Woods Hole was no stranger to historic discoveries. They had found the wreckage of Air France Flight 447. They had located the data recorder from the cargo ship El Faro. They had participated in the search for Amelia Earhart's plane. And before any of that, 30 years earlier, they had found the Titanic. The WHOI team spent a week and a half aboard the research vessel in June 2015, unsuccessfully searching for the San Jose. Unfortunately, they had to discontinue the operation because the vehicle was scheduled elsewhere. A few days after the team returned and resumed operations in November 2015, the Remus found what looked like a promising target. They redeployed the vehicle to the site the next day and took high-resolution photos from about 30 feet above the wreck. And then, on Thanksgiving Day 2015, in a waterfront apartment in Cartagena, Roger Dooley sat in front of a computer screen and watched the footage arrive. Clicking through grainy sonar images, Dooley and his colleague saw a sword hilt sticking out of the sand and 3 bronze cannons lying in a bed of seashells, each bearing a small dolphin-shaped marking, the telltale signature that identified the wreck. His hands trembled. 3 decades, 1 archive in Seville, a packet of sewn letters, a handwritten navigator's book in London, a hedge fund partner in England, an autonomous underwater vehicle from Cape Cod, and finally, 60 meters of dark water and the dolphins. The San Jose had been found. What happened next, however? The announcement, the politics, the erasure, the legal battles that are still being fought as you listen to these words, is a story that deserves its own chapter. And it is the one we will tell next. When the news broke on December 5th, 2015, it moved through the world, the way great announcements tend to, quickly, loudly, and with considerably less nuance than the story deserved. Colombia's then president, Juan Manuel Santos, stood before cameras and declared that the San Jose had been found. "This is the most valuable treasure that has been found in the history of humanity," Santos said. It was a remarkable statement. It was also, depending on how one looked at it, only partially true. Because while the ship had indeed been found, the story of who found it and who would be credited was already quietly being rewritten. Though the holy grail of shipwrecks had been found by an international team, Santos reinvented the tale of the San Jose's discovery as a feel-good story starring Colombians. Roger Dooley, the Cuban-American archaeologist who had spent 31 years assembling the archival case that made the discovery possible, who had stood in the Seville heat in 1984 reading smuggled letters by candlelight, who had formed the company and convinced the president and retained the Woods Hole team, found his name absent from the government's announcement. The Colombian government declared his involvement a national secret, essentially writing him out of his own story. A year later, as a parting gesture, outgoing President Santos at last publicly credited Dooley. But since then, so many factions had been fighting over ownership of the wreck, from the financial backer to Spain to Colombia to the descendants of the indigenous tribes in Bolivia whose ancestors had been forced to mine the silver, that the galleon and its treasure had been locked in limbo. Dooley, now 81, had not expected to ignite an international incident with the discovery. He had expected to excavate a ship. He had expected the painstaking, methodical work of underwater archaeology, the careful cataloging of artifacts, the documentation of a historical site, the slow and deliberate reconstruction of a story that had been interrupted on the evening of June 8, 1708. What he received instead was something far more familiar to anyone who has ever stumbled upon something enormously valuable. Everyone else's claim to it. The disputes came quickly, from every direction, and with a complexity that no single courtroom was easily equipped to resolve. Colombia moved first and most decisively. In the weeks following the announcement, the government classified the location of the San Jose as a state secret, effectively preventing Spain and other claimants from independently verifying the site or participating in its examination. This was a calculated move. By controlling the coordinates, Colombia controlled the narrative. The ship was in Colombian waters, discovered with Colombian government authorization, aboard a Colombian Navy research vessel. In Colombia's telling, the San Jose was Colombian. Spain disagreed, profoundly and immediately. Spain maintains that the San Jose was a commissioned warship of the Spanish Navy, crewed by Spanish sailors serving under orders of the Spanish crown, carrying cargo belonging to the Spanish state, and that it therefore remains sovereign property of Spain, regardless of its current location. Under principles of sovereign immunity embedded in international maritime law, sunken state vessels do not enter the realm of finders-keepers' salvage rights, but remain under the exclusive jurisdiction of the flag state indefinitely. It is a legally serious argument. The same principle has been applied to other sunken naval vessels around the world. The idea that a ship commissioned by a sovereign state in active military service, lost in battle, does not become the property of whoever happens to find it 3 centuries later. Spain had not abandoned the San Jose. Spain had lost it in a war. There is, in international maritime law, a meaningful difference between the two. Colombia has not ratified the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea or the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, both of which support the principle that sunken state vessels retain the sovereign immunity of their flag state. This is not an oversight on Colombia's part. It is a choice that preserves Colombia's ability to govern what sits in its own waters without being bound by international frameworks designed, in part, with the interests of former colonial powers in mind. The legal architecture of underwater heritage law was built largely by nations that built ships. The nations whose shores those ships were built to exploit had less say in its construction. Sea Search Armada, the American salvage company that had been fighting since 1981, was not finished either. In 2022, Sea Search Armada filed a case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, seeking approximately $10 billion in compensation, arguing that the supposed later Colombian discovery in a new secret location was actually the same site they had found in 1981, and that the new coordinates were merely a ruse to invalidate their prior claim. A ruling on Sea Search Armada's claim had been anticipated by the end of 2025. Whether that ruling will bring resolution or simply produce a new layer of dispute remains, as of this telling, an open question. And then there is the voice that is perhaps the most morally serious of all, the one that comes not from a government or a company or a legal team, but from the descendants of the people who were made to dig the gold out of the earth in the first place. The indigenous Quillicas, Carangas, and Chichas peoples of Bolivia insist they have a claim to the treasure because it was extracted through their ancestors' forced labor. They have petitioned Spain and UNESCO to declare the galleon as common and shared heritage, ensuring they too benefit from any proceeds of the ship's recovery. Our native communities consider any act of intervention and unilateral appropriation of the galleon, without consulting us directly and without expressly and effectively considering its common and shared character, to be an act of plunder and neo-colonialism. The indigenous communities stated in letters sent to UNESCO and Spain. This is not a legal argument in the conventional sense. It is something older and harder to dismiss, a moral accounting. The gold in the hold of the San José did not come from nowhere. It was pulled from the ground by human hands. Hands that belonged to people who were not asked, who were not paid, who did not choose, and who did not survive the labor in numbers that would ever be fully counted. The San José is, among other things, a container of extracted suffering, and the question of whether any government or company or salvage operation can simply claim that suffering as their treasure, is a question that no international court has yet been willing to answer directly. Samuel Flores, the legal voice of the Caracara before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, advocates not for commodifying the recovered treasures, but for their transformation into symbols of shared heritage preserved in a museum. It is a position that deserves more attention than it typically receives in coverage that tends to focus on the billions of dollars and the lawyers in The Hague. UNESCO, for its part, intervened as early as 2018. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization advised Colombia not to commercially exploit, in other words, salvage, the shipwreck, underscoring its cultural significance. Allowing the commercial exploitation of Colombia's cultural heritage goes against the best scientific standards and international ethical principles as laid down in the UNESCO Underwater Cultural Heritage Convention, the agency stated at the time. Colombia, which had never signed that convention, was not bound by that advice. But it listened to some degree. In 2020, Colombia's government declared all of the San José's contents to be assets of cultural interest, meaning no artifacts from the wreck could now be taken out of the country or sold. The commercial salvage option, at least officially, was closed. The ship would be treated as heritage, not as windfall. In May 2024, Colombia declared the site of the shipwreck a protected archaeological area. Then President Gustavo Petro announced plans for an underwater research project to survey and eventually recover the wreck's contents for a future museum in Cartagena. And then, in November 2025, 317 years after the San José sank, and 44 years after Sea Search Armada first claimed to have found it, and 31 years after Roger Dooley read those letters in Seville. Colombian scientists recovered the first physical artifacts from the depths of the Caribbean Sea: a bronze cannon, 3 ancient coins, pottery, and porcelain items from the ship's remains at a depth of approximately 600 meters. The cannon is bronze. It is cast with the curling motif of a dolphin, just like all the others that still lie in the sediment below. The coins are gold, their faces stamped with castles and lions and crosses, the heraldry of a monarchy that no longer exists, minted in a colony that is now a sovereign nation, aboard a ship that was supposed to save a war that ended more than 3 centuries ago. Even the retrieval drew backlash from archaeologists who argued that no scientific reasons were given for the extraction and that the equipment used was far from optimal. What destroys deep-sea archaeological contexts that are not at risk, like this one, is human intervention, noted deep-sea maritime archaeology expert Rodrigo Pacheco Ruiz. The argument, in other words, continues. It has always continued. From the moment the San Jose touched the bottom of the sea, argument has been the natural condition of everyone who has ever pointed toward it and said, "Mine." There is a bronze cannon at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea. It has been there since the evening of June 8, 1708, and on its surface, cast 3 centuries ago by Spanish craftsmen in a foundry in Seville, is a single word: Sevilla. The first bronze cannon recovered from the San Jose in November 2025 is inscribed with the word Sevilla, a marking that anchors the object not merely to a ship, but to the city, the hands, the specific moment in human time in which it was made. A cannon does not have feelings, but it carries something like memory. The memory of the forge, of the foundry floor, of the men who poured the metal and watched it cool and ran their thumbs along the dolphin carved into its surface before loading it onto a ship bound for the other side of the world. That cannon went to sea, it fought in a battle, and then it went to the bottom of the ocean, and it waited there for 317 years while the world above it changed beyond all recognition. When it was brought to the surface and placed in the conservation laboratory of the Caribbean Oceanographic and Hydrographic Research Center in Cartagena, it had not been touched by human hands since the night it sank. That fact alone, that simple physical continuity between 1708 and 2025, is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. While the San Jose's cargo is often estimated to be worth billions today, archaeologists and historians stress that the wreck's true value lies in its cultural and scientific importance. Shipboard materials, preserved ceramics and personal effects provide evidence of colonial trade, global networks, and life aboard an early 18th century galleon. Colombia's culture minister said something important on the day the first artifacts were unveiled in Cartagena. This historic event demonstrates the strengthening of the Colombian state's technical, professional, and technological capabilities to protect and promote underwater cultural heritage as part of Colombian identity and history, the minister stated. And the director of Colombia's Institute of Anthropology and History put it even more plainly: the recovery opens the possibility for citizens to approach, through material evidence, the history of the San Jose galleon. That phrase is worth returning to. Through material evidence, not through estimates, not through courtrooms, not through the cold arithmetic of billions, through a porcelain cup. 3 hammered coins, a cannon with a word stamped into its side, because the San Jose is not, at its heart, a story about treasure. It never was. It is a story about what empires do, how they build, how they extract, how they wage war on one another, using the labor of people they never intended to acknowledge. It is a story about a ship that was sent to save a crown, and a battle that decided nothing, and 600 men who died on a quiet evening in Caribbean waters without enough time to be afraid. Spain has additionally emphasized the significance of the wreck as a site where nearly 600 Spanish sailors lost their lives in the service of the Spanish crown, giving the vessel both cultural and memorial importance as a war grave. A war grave. That designation matters. Beneath all the legal arguments, beneath the competing national interests and the arbitration proceedings at The Hague, and the question of who found what and when, there are 600 people buried in that sediment. Their names are mostly gone, dissolved into the bureaucratic silence of colonial record-keeping, or simply never written down at all. But they were real. They had letters from home in their quarters, or they didn't. They had opinions about the food, or the captain, or the likelihood of making it back to Spain before the hurricane season. They looked across 60 meters of dark water at the lights of a British warship closing in, and then the world ended for them so quickly that the survivors could barely describe it. We owe them something. The least we can offer is honesty about what the San Jose is and what it represents, not just as a prize, but as a grave site, a colonial artifact, a repository of stolen labor, a diplomatic flashpoint, and a genuinely extraordinary piece of human history. Julian Sancton, who wrote the most comprehensive account of the San Jose's modern story, put it this way: "You're not benefiting anybody by leaving the San Jose where it is. I would like to see these artifacts, and I think humanity would too. To me, the wreck should be a gift owned by all of humanity." That is a generous idea. It is also, in the current climate of competing national claims and international arbitration, a deeply idealistic one. But idealism has its place in the telling of a story like this, because the alternative, treating the San Jose purely as a financial instrument, a legal battlefield, a number with a dollar sign in front of it, is to miss what has made it compelling across 3 centuries of human attention. As of mid-2026, the case remains a focal point of international arbitration at The Hague, and Colombia continues to move forward with plans for a world-class museum in Cartagena. The scientific community is publishing fresh analyses of the coins and artifacts already recovered. The legal proceedings grind forward with the slow, determined patience of institutions that outlast the people arguing within them. And the rest of the San Jose, the gold, the silver, the emeralds, the Chinese porcelain dinner service, still apparently intact in the dark, remains exactly where it has always been, 600 meters below the surface, 12 miles from the shore of Cartagena. In water so cold and so still that time, down there moves differently. The San Jose waited 3 centuries for the world to find it. It is patient. It knows something the lawyers and the governments and the salvage companies are still learning, that the sea does not rush, that the past does not yield its meaning simply because we demand it, that some stories take exactly as long as they take to tell, and that the telling itself is a form of respect for the people who live them. This has been the story of the San Jose, a ship built by careful hands in the Basque country of Spain, a cannon stamped with a city's name, an empire's desperate last wager, a battle in the dark, 300 years of silence, and, finally, in the waters of a Caribbean coast, a robot's light moving slowly over the seafloor, pausing over a bronze dolphin, a scattered coin, the long settled wreckage of something that was once alive, and proud, and sailing toward home.